Okay, we're going to take a look at some of the compositing features we have to integrate both of these wonderful software programs together. And the reason we have to composite certain things is because, well, some things just don't work in Vue. Uh, for instance, we can't do character animation in Vue. Therefore, we have to composite what we have in Lightwave with Vue. We also can't do hypervoxels and things like that within Vue. So we have to use Lightwave to blend together the two different elements. So what we're actually going to be doing is going ahead and creating a scene in Vue and bringing it over to Lightwave and adding some dynamics and some hypervoxels and have it interact with the scene. So we're going to start out by adding a standard terrain. I'm going to go ahead and double click on this terrain. And I want to carve in a nice little pathway, sort of like a trench through the whole terrain that we could have our particles kind of flowing through. The first thing I want to do though is go ahead and raise up some of these sides over here so it's a little more equal all the way around, and that way we don't have it so much as a standard mountain. So we could just go ahead and brush these sides out here and just kind of raise it up so it's all getting kind of in the red area. And then that should be good. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pretty much bring this trench down to almost a black. The black is the lowest point, because that will remove our texture that we have on here. So I'm going to change the size of our brush to make it a little bit smaller. Increase our softness, our flow. I'm going to change it to dig. And I'm just going to go through here and kind of make a trench. And we might need to make it a little more flow in here so it goes a little bit faster. And we just kind of want to carve this out. And we also want to have a nice curve in it. And that way we can have our particles coming around the corner, and that way we don't see exactly where they start out. I'm going to increase our size, decrease our softness, and then we'll go a little bit quicker. What I also need to do is sort of raise up this area, because of course we don't want it down to the black area, because there would be pretty much no geometry there. So we want to switch back to the raise, and I'm going to increase our softness and decrease our flow a little, and then go ahead and just kind of bring up this area, and that might have been a little bit too much, so I'm going to go ahead and undo that. Increase our softness, decrease our flow a little, and just kind of come in here and just raise up these areas. And you also want to have a nice blend sort of coming back, because when we kind of do this we get a sharp cutoff, so you just want to kind of go in there and blend that. Maybe we'll increase our flow just a little bit more. We're just trying to prevent any major bumps in this trench, just so that we don't have anything for the particles to kind of hang up on, because we're going to be using this terrain as a collision object within Lightwave. I'm going to click OK, and we're going to take a look at that and see how it looks. And we're going to move our end down here and just take a look at where that trench is. And maybe we need to go just a little bit deeper with it and kind of raise up the sides just a little so it looks a little better. So we're going to switch this to raise and just move it up on the sides so it goes a little higher. Not to the point where it's reaching white, but just enough so it's nice and high around there, so we have a nice trench, and we can go ahead and use that to block out certain areas. I'm going to use dig now and just bring this back down just a little. Not quite down to the black, but down a little lower. Click OK, and we'll see that we have a much better looking trench here. And the reason for this bend too is we'll be adding our particles starting about right here and flowing towards the camera, and that way, since we're around a corner, we don't need to worry about the starting point of those particles. And now I actually want to make sure we set up the camera correctly, because we're going to be using our camera motion from Vue and using that in Lightwave to frame our shot. What we can also do is set our sky. So we want to go to Atmosphere, Load Atmosphere, and I'm going to select the Rainy Alaska from Bad Weather, and go ahead and click OK. It'll give us some nice coloration. We also have to keep in mind is our light setting. If we go ahead and select our sunlight, we have it set at point at camera, and we just move that around and take a look in our preview window to kind of see where our shadows are at. And maybe I want to come down and have it pretty high in the scene. And we don't see too many shadows, but we'll have all our shadows kind of behind what's going on. What we also need to do is select our texture for our terrain, because this specific terrain right here will not have any textures within layout, or we'll be actually using the rendered version of the Vue scene. So we're going to go ahead and click this little arrow right here, and just select one of these textures. We can try the scrub line and see how that looks. And it looks pretty neat. We have our trench going through here, nice green grass on the bottom. We could even try something else, natural 2, see how that looks. You just kind of want to play around with it, see what you want exactly. And we're actually going to be adding an ecosystem to this, but just a little bit later. So first we just kind of want to take a look at what we already have. And actually we're just going to go back to that scrub line, and we'll use that. And we're going to be adding trees in a little bit, but first we want to take a look at sort of our collision objects that we have going on. Pretty much everything overall looks pretty good. We're not going to really add any fog to this, just pretty much this basic scene that we have right now. We might edit the light just a little. And we have a little bit of shadow in here now. Adds a little more depth to the scene. And maybe I'll bring it down. And there we go. Now what we want to do is set up our resolution for our render, our final render, because we need to make sure that we have this all set up in Vue before we go ahead and bring it all into Lightwave. So what we want to do is go to our render options, and actually we could change this later and make it larger if we wanted, but we'll have to re-render it, and depending if you're doing an animation or not, that could be a large deal. But we're gonna switch this to render to screen. We're just going to do 640 by 480, because that's pretty much our default setting in Lightwave, and that's a round television standard. In actuality, it's 720 by 480, but the pixel aspect ratio is 0.9, but this is pretty much the equivalent of television on a computer monitor. I'm going to select Final for our render quality, and that way we get all of our shadows and all of our nice anti-aliasing on that. And then we can just go ahead and click render. And then this will render our scene. And our texture looks like it's a little bit large around here, so we could go ahead and scale that down if we wanted. We'll just select our terrain. We're going to change our scale to 0.5. And that way it'll look a little bit nicer, and we'll get some better texture resolution in there. What I just want to note is that we could also use a procedural terrain for this, and although we cannot export procedural terrains to Lightwave, we can use the procedural terrain to do these renderings for the compositing, and then convert them to standard terrains, which you can do by, if we have a procedural terrain, so if this was selected procedural, I don't want to change it right now because it might mess up our terrain. But if we started out with a procedural, we could easily just switch back to a standard. It'll give us all of our elevation still, and then we can go ahead and export that standard terrain. Okay, so I'm going to go back and render this now. And as you can see, we have a little bit better looking texture on here. It's a little stretched out around here. But like I said, we're going to be changing the texture. Just right now, this is just pretty much our base texture. I'm just going to be showing you to kind of get the idea across of how we can do this and composite, and then we're going to go back and make it look a lot nicer. So what we want to do is click on this little disk right here and go ahead and save our image. And once we have it saved, we can close this out. And now we want to export our scene. So I'm going to go to File, Export Entire Scene. And actually there is one other thing we have to do, and that is we still have our ground plane in here. So we want to go ahead and delete that just by hitting the delete key after selecting it. And now we don't have to worry about that ground plane messing up what is going on in layout, because that can sometimes happen. So we want to go back to export entire scene now that our ground plane is gone. We do not need to generate our color maps, our bump maps, or any alpha maps, or any of that sort, because with this compositing technique, we're going to be using front projection in layout, so we won't really need that. And we want to go ahead and take a look at our terrain. And this is pretty much our mesh resolution for our terrain, since it's the only object in the scene. And we want to bring that up a little higher. Of course, we need to change this to a Lightwave scene export. And those polygons at 5,000, maybe we'll bring it down a little bit lower, because this will translate a little bit differently. This won't be exactly the same as what we will see in layout. And then we want to go ahead and just browse and save the scene. And then we can just go ahead and click OK. And I just exported our scene. So now we can go and jump over to Lightwave and load the scene in. Okay, we now have the scene loaded in, but as you can see, our grid size is a little off, so everything is really condensed in the center. So we go to our camera view and just hit the left bracket key and go and bring that down just a bit. So now we can get everything in view, and as you can see, our light is facing exactly where it should be, just where we had it before, and so is our camera. It's exactly where it should be. And our terrain. So if we take a look, and our zoom is exactly the same as it was in Vue, because that stuff will transfer over. So if we go to our camera mode, go to properties, we can see that our zoom factor is set to 2.6, which is on an envelope, even though that envelope is not changing. And because of that, we could actually delete that envelope if we wanted to, just by holding down Shift and clicking on the E. And that will remove our envelope. Now, if we go ahead and render this, you can see we just have a black background with our terrain. And you also notice that we have these fragments, polygons kind of sticking out from inside of the terrain, and that's just caused by our conversion. So we're going to go to our surface editor, and we're going to turn off double-sided on that terrain, just like we did earlier, and render it, and we can see those are gone. But we don't have anything else in the scene, so we need to go and load in that image we rendered from Vue. Okay, if we take a look here, we have our render, and I'm going to go ahead and close this out and hit Control F7 on the keyboard. And this is going to bring up our compositing panel. And under background image, we're going to select that render and go ahead and close that out. And if we render it now, we can see that we'll have our sky. And because our terrain is a little bit lower resolution than, actually quite a bit lower than what we have in Vue, you can see we have a little bit of a difference in here. But that's not going to matter too much, because that's not really going to show up once we start throwing everything in. And plus, once we get the ecosystem in, we're actually going to have to change the size of our collision. And we also want to use a lower res terrain for the collision object, because we don't want it to take forever to calculate those particles. And the more geometry you have, the longer it's going to take to calculate. But we also need to project our image onto this terrain now, so that we get our texture. So we're going to go back to our surface editor, and under the color texture editor, we're going to select front projection and select that image. I'm going to turn off pixel blending because we don't need that on, because we are rendering at 640 by 480, and that's the size of the image, so we don't need to worry about that. And I'll go ahead and close this out, and now we can render that frame again. And as you can see, we have sort of a difference in our shadows here. And the main reason for that is we had shadows in Vue. There is a way to get rid of that if you need to. And what you can actually do is, instead of projecting this image onto the terrain, you can use your color map saved from the terrain. The only problem with that is then we won't be able to use the ecosystems. So there are different, it really depends on what you want in your scene. Like I said, right now, if we had an ecosystem in here, we couldn't apply just a texture map to it, because we wouldn't see the trees or anything like that. So there are certain ways you have to work with it in order to get it to work. There's another thing too. If you take a look at our timeline down here, you can see we just have one frame. And the reason for that is we don't have an animation in Vue. And it's a complete scene conversion from Vue to Lightwave, so it's using all of the frames, all of the animation, and since there is no animation, nothing's going to show up. If we hold down Control Shift, right mouse click, and go to Render Options, you'll see that we have render first frame is 0, and our last frame is 0. So therefore, no animation. But of course, we're just going to be doing a still scene from Vue and then our animated particles. So I'm automatically just going to go up and change this to 60 frames because we're just going to do 2 seconds. Go back to our render options. We can change that up to 60. Make our first frame 1. So that we're back to our default settings. And make sure you hit enter after that so it saves it. And we can turn this off because we don't need it right now. And if we turn on ray trace shadows and go ahead and render that, we should see those other shadows in there as well. So we'll render that frame. And our shadows match up now as they weren't before. But it is a little bit of a difference because, like I said, of our geometry is a little bit different. And plus, our lighting is actually different than what we have in Vue. Now our light is facing the correct direction, it's the correct intensity, but our global illumination is quite different. So if we go to our lighting panel, so make sure we select light, go to properties, select global illumination, our ambient intensity is quite low. While in Vue it's a bit higher by default. So we can up that if we wanted to, and that'll get rid of sort of our shadowing in here. We could bring it up to about 15% and see how that looks. And go ahead and render that frame, and that should make a bit of a difference around here. It is a little bit lighter, it's still pretty dark overall. And like I said, we have a few issues with our shadowing because of the size of our terrain. But we could change that if we needed to, just by going back into Vue and reloading the scene with a higher mesh. But like I said before, that doesn't matter too much because we're going to be throwing an ecosystem on it. But there are a few things we will have to change when we do that. So I'm first going to actually show you the interaction that we have here. If you notice, because we have everything projected on here, if we actually took an object, we could put it behind this trench over here and we wouldn't be able to see it at all. And that's because we're kind of using this terrain that we loaded in as sort of a depth map. Except it's a real geometry, so it's much better than using a depth map. So we can throw in certain objects behind that, and they'll be hidden entirely, and it'll all match up with our image. So if we have something behind here, we won't be able to see it till it comes out through that terrain, and that's what we're going to do by adding particles. So what I want to start out doing is actually adding a null object. Go to Items, add a null, and we're going to keep it named null, and that should be fine. And go ahead and just move it into position, and this is going to be converted into our particle emitter. And we just want to make sure it's out of view, and it is because we're behind that corner and we don't see it. Another way to fix these shadow problems too is just to load in actually another terrain, and first of all calculate your particles with this lower resolution terrain, and then save that motion file of the particles, and then you could reload them back in with a higher resolution terrain, and that will take care of all your shadowing issues that you might be having if you're using just a terrain by itself and no ecosystem. Because with an ecosystem, you're going to see a big change as we switch that over. And I'll be showing you that in a little bit, but first we want to set up our particle motion. So I'm going to make sure we have the object selected. Go to Properties, and under Dynamics, we're going to make it an emitter. You can see our emitter is quite large, because of course our relation between objects in Vue and Lightwave are quite different because there's no real grid system in Vue. There's it starts at 1 to infinity, and it's not a measure of meters or feet, and you really don't know what it is, so they won't exactly match up entirely. So always keep that in mind. And now we're going to double click on this emitter. We're going to go ahead and scale it down 0.1 so we get 100 millimeters. And so it's not too big. and not too small. Maybe just a little bit bigger on which axis here? On the z-axis. We can make it, type in 0.2, and look at it just a little bit bigger. I also want to go ahead and rotate this. So if we could just scroll through with the scroll button on your mouse if you have one. Otherwise, you could just go to Modify and select Rotate. We can grab this red heading bar and go ahead and just kind of point that in the direction of our, oops, switch back to layout, in the direction of our trench and where we're going. So we need to set up our motion. If we go ahead and scroll through here, we just have our particles being created, and there's no motion. So we want to set up gravity and velocity, because we need some of our velocity to be pointing our particles in the right direction, and gravity to keep them down, going the correct direction. So we're going to go in motion, and under velocity, we want to have it pretty much going off on the z-axis and the x-axis, but we need to make sure which is negative and which is positive. So we have our negative z right here, and we have our negative x over here. So we want to be going on the negative x and the negative z about equally, and that way it will go at like about a 45-degree angle. So velocity, we want to go negative. We'll just type that in, negative. We'll try 1.5 and then negative 1.5 on the z, and we'll take a look and see what happens there. And we're actually going off a little farther than we need to. I'm going to turn off the x and see what happens. And now we're going directly off on that z. So for the x, we want to do a -3 possibly, and that way we get more in that 45-degree angle. That's still not quite going the direction we need it to, so maybe we need it to go a little bit less on our z. You can do a -1, and that's looking a little bit better. But keep in mind our speed is being changed too, so right now we're just kind of looking for the relation between which direction it should be heading towards. Because it's much easier to do it this way than it would be to set up a wind object, although we could do that as well. But this way we can keep it all within the particle emitter, and we don't need to worry about adding wind objects or gravity objects or anything of that sort. We also want to change our gravity to a -1.2, should be alright. Keep in mind, like I said, with our relation, normally gravity's -9.8, but it's going to be a little bit different because we have all this other stuff going on and different sizes, and this isn't necessarily going to be pulled down by gravity as much as everything else. So we can probably bring that down to a -2 to see a little bit of a change there. And it's going down a little more. Of course, our velocity is quite high, but that should be alright. Now we're going to go ahead and select our terrain. We're going to add dynamic collision. Double-click on the collision, and we're going to change the type to object. And now we can see our grid in here. And if we go ahead and take a look at our particles, you can see that it's already starting to react with our grids, our terrain slightly. The only problem is they are pretty much going through, but if we calculate them, you can see we have them really bursting out in just about every direction. We'll go to the camera mode and take a look and see what's going on. They're coming through that trench, they're bouncing off all over the place, so we might want to change that up a bit so it's not so much of a bounce. And we could also increase our gravity too, so they're not flying up in the air as much. But that's all caused by our velocity, which is set kind of high. So we could also change our velocity on this particle object. So if we take a look at back in our emitter and go back to motion, our velocity we can change to -1.5 on that negative x and -0.5 on the z, and that way we'll still get the same direction, but we won't have our velocity so high that everything's really bouncing off so much. So you just want to keep the relation and the ratio together after you've found which direction you want to go to. So go ahead and calculate that again. You can see we have a little bit of a weird motion here, and that could be caused by our gravity, but it's mostly caused by the shape of our terrain and kind of what's going on in here. We have a kind of a whirlwind effect because of it, and because of our bounce is so high on this collision object. So we're going to go back to our collision object, select it, and under our bounce bind power, bring it down to 150, and go ahead and calculate and see what happens there. As you can see, that we have a lot different effect. We're going to go back to our camera view, and we can kind of watch this, and we can see everything is just starting to come in. So of course, if you wanted these coming towards the camera, you could go ahead and edit that the way you wanted to, but we're going to leave it just at 60 seconds, because you can, or 60 frames, sorry, because you can see what's going on. And if you want to make any additional changes, you can go ahead and do that. There's another thing, actually, if we were to render this right now and add hypervoxels, our calculation is going to disappear on this particle object. So we have a little bit of a sort of a bug in Lightwave right now when we're using VU scenes, and hopefully they fix that soon. But the way to kind of get rid of that, well, we want to keep the same motion. We're going to throw in a few more particles, though. I'm going to change our birth rate to 200 and make our particle limit 5,000, and go ahead and recalculate that, because our particles will disappear, and I just want to make sure we have the right amount right now that we're going to be rendering with, and you should be able to see that right now. We might increase it even just a little bit higher, maybe up to 300, and go ahead and calculate that, and that way we can define our hypervoxel shapes a little bit better and kind of see what's going on a little bit more. Okay, but what we want to do now is actually we're going to have to save this motion file. So when I go into our camera view, we can watch, we can see it start to come down, and of course if you wanted to expand it, we can go up to 90 frames if we wanted, and go to our particles, set the lifetime to 90 frames, recalculate, and we should see them come down a little bit farther, and maybe that'll look better as a animation in that sense. So they're just coming down a little bit more. Switch our perspective view. Actually, I'm going to recalculate that. And now we can watch what's going on. You see we have a few of our particles kind of hanging back, but the majority of them are going through this trench. And we'll just wait a sec for that. Okay, and now we're going to go back to our camera view. We'll go ahead and watch this. We could see all of our particles start to come down, and it makes a nice little animation. And we can make this water, we can make this smoke, we can make this whatever we wanted. But if we actually turn hypervoxels on right now, like I said, this is actually going to disappear. And I'm just going to show you that right now. So hit Control F5 to bring up our effects panel, or Control F6 to bring you directly to the volumetrics tab, and we can add hypervoxels. Double click on hypervoxels, and we're going to select that null. Hit F7 on the keyboard to bring up our Viper, and then we can kind of see what's going on. I'm just going to grab a quick preset here. Go to Fire and Smoke, and we'll just grab Fire. Maybe Fire-ish, because then we don't have to change our light settings. And as you see, that's pretty bright. Maybe we'll even make smoke out of that. We'll just grab that smoke preset. That looks a little better. We can work with that. So now, as we're going through and scrubbing through, we can see what's happening. And of course, we really don't have enough particles to really make a really nice scene. But this will give you an idea of how to kind of composite these things together. But I'm going to go ahead and render this now with our hypervoxels on, and take a look and see what happens. So F9, or I can go to the Render tab and click Render Frame. Alright, as we can see our render, no particles in the scene, no hypervoxels, and like I said, that's a little bug we got there's going on right now. Hopefully by 8.5 or 9.0, or it might even be a VU issue. But there is a way to get around that and make these recalculated, because the problem is the calculation is disappearing once we start to render. So if we go back to our objects panel, we can recalculate these particles, and then what we're actually going to do is go ahead and save the motion file, and then run this particle system off of the motion file and not from any of the settings. So you want to make sure when you do that you have the right particle motion set. Otherwise, you're going to have to go back and make a bunch of changes, and it's going to be a little more difficult. Alright, so we're going to go back to our emitter, and we're going to go to File, and we want to save it. Or actually, make sure we save the motion. And I've just gone ahead and saved that, and actually, it's gone ahead and already applied it, and now everything in here is disabled because it's running off of this motion file. And we have our playback set to normal, which is just what we had before. And now if we go ahead, switch back to our camera view, make sure there's some particles in the scene, and now if I go ahead and render that, we're going to be able to see those particles show up and those hypervoxels. Okay, so now we can see our hypervoxels in the scene coming through our trench. We also have our shadows being affected onto our hypervoxels. We also have our hypervoxels casting shadows onto our terrain, as you can see in here. And like I said, with this many particles and these settings on our hypervoxels, it's not going to look very good, but it gives you an idea of what exactly you can do by combining these together. Now, there is a problem. If we were to create an ecosystem, we couldn't have these directly butting up against our terrain, because what's going to happen is it's going to go through the trees, and it's not going to look right, and it's really not going to blend together. So what we want to do, I'm going to go ahead and close out this render, and we're going to go back into Vue and create this ecosystem, re-render the frame, and then just reproject. And then I'll show you how to edit it when using an ecosystem. We want to select our terrain, go to our material, double-clicking on the actual preview of the material. We're going to select ecosystem, and I just want to add some trees in here. Nothing special, so we're going to add plant. Wait for that to come up. We're going to select the plum tree. And now, because we don't really know the size and the scale relation between what one is and what the terrain is, I'm going to bring our scale down a little bit small to about 0.3. And I'm just going to hit populate and see where these trees show up. And it's about the right size. We might want to make them a little smaller. I'm going to go ahead and bring it down to 0.1, repopulate. And now we can see we have small trees in there, so maybe we'll go up to 0.2. And that should be good. Of course, we want to change our density. I'm going to make it quite dense, because I want mostly everything to be covered with those trees. And that looks pretty good, so we're going to click OK. And now we have our ecosystem in here. And of course, we don't need to re-export because we can't export ecosystems into Lightwave as of yet. I believe they are working on a software program for that. So hopefully in the future, we will be able to actually use these ecosystems in Lightwave and ignore this process altogether. But we're going to go ahead and render this frame now, and then we can load it back into layout. Okay, we have our image loaded into Lightwave, and we'll take a look at our completed render. And as you can see, now with our ecosystem, our shadow is broken up a lot more, and we can only see little bits of the rock here and there. But you also notice that because of the ecosystem, it's much higher than the terrain. If we take a look in the relation to the background of the wireframe versus this negative space right here, you can see that our trees actually go all the way up to that point of the render area, and right here there's a big gap. So that's going to make a big difference with our particles. If we went ahead and rendered right now, when we swap these images out, you're going to notice that our hypervoxels are now matching up correctly. So we need to change the size of our collision object. But first, I'm going to go ahead and swap over these images. So Control F7, bring up our compositing. We're going to select that new render, which is going to bring up our trees. Make sure we select that. There we go. And we also want to go to our surface editor, and under our terrain, front projection of the new terrain. And I'm going to go ahead and render this really quick just to show you exactly what's going to happen and what's going to look like. Okay, we actually have multiple problems in here. One is our shadows. As you can see, it is a flat surface, and because of our shadows in here, we're causing quite a bit of weirdness in here. So what we can actually do is go ahead and just turn off shadows altogether on our terrain, and then we don't have to worry about all this weird stuff happening here. What we could also do is up our luminosity up to 100% and decrease our diffusion down to 0, and that will also take care of it. But if we take a look at our hypervoxels here, you can see they're not blending in at the right spots, and because of the trees are sticking out over here, they're not really coming around the pass through this little trench correctly. So we need to make some changes. I'm going to go ahead and close this out. And first we want to take care of our terrain and get rid of those shadows that are being caused uh, and kind of the weirdness from them. So I'm going to open up the object properties, and we could exclude it from lights. We could also go to the render and turn off self shadow, and we could turn off receive shadow as well. But then we're going to lose some of our shadows, or all of our shadows, from our hypervoxels. But I am going to turn off cast shadow. Of course, we do want our shadows showing up on our hypervoxels, so we might just leave that. But we're going to turn off the self shadow. And if we go ahead to our surface editor and increase our luminosity to 100%, decrease our diffusion to 0, this will take care of our shading that's going on. And this way we can use the shadows that are from Vue, and we don't have to use the Lightwave shadows that are being created because we're not going to need them. Of course, when we're doing this as well, we're going to lose our shadows from our hypervoxels. So you really got to pick one or the other. We'll go ahead and render this now, and you can see what it looks like. Okay, as you can see, we have a little bit of distortion in here, and that's mostly caused by just where our image map is, and the fact that our terrain is coming up right here, and we have a problem with our hypervoxels coming through this area. So I'm going to adjust our collision right now. So I'm going to go ahead and select our collision object, our terrain, open up the properties for it, go to dynamics, and we need to change our radius. And we just want to make it a little bit bigger, maybe 1 meter, and see what happens here. We don't see much of a change in here. And we also need to recalculate our particles and go back through that. 1 meter is going to be kind of big, because of course 1 meter is 2 of these giant blocks, so that's going to make a big difference on that collision object. So we're going to change that down to probably about 50 millimeters, or maybe 100 millimeters. We just don't want to go very high, and we're not really seeing that reflected in here right now, but when we do our particles we should see that. So we select our particle emitter, go back to our object properties, and we want to get rid of the file. So what we need to do is clear the motion, and now we have where we were at before, and what we can go ahead and do is recalculate. Okay, we'll switch to the camera and take a look, and you can see that we have our level changed on our terrain, but it's a lot higher than it needs to be. But of course, you also have to take in the effect that our hypervoxels are larger than the actual particles. So we can actually show those hypervoxels so we can see them in relation to exactly where our trees are. So Control F6, double click on hypervoxels, and we're going to show particles. And this will show up our hypervoxels, their size anyway. We can see them coming through, and obviously they're not connecting to our terrain because we've changed that radius, the level of it, and now we can have that effect of the trees. But of course we are seeing through here a little bit, so we can compensate for that too as well by increasing the terrain size, the actual terrain size if we wanted, or we could throw in another, actually go in and edit the object in Modeler for that and kind of drag it out, and that will make some additions to that as well. So there's lots of things that you have to kind of keep in mind when you're playing around with ecosystems and Lightwave, because there's a lot of stuff you got to deal with because of the incompatibilities of certain things, and especially with this compositing overall. Another major thing is the shadows of our hypervoxels. I'm going to go ahead and render this really quick and just show you what's going to happen with our shadows. And actually we want to make sure too that we go back and grab those particles, recalculate them, and actually save them, because we have that little bit of a bug in there. So we'll go back and recalculate that and save it. Okay, the height of our particles is now correct, as we can see right here, but we're having a little bit problem with the shadows, and also we still have this cutoff here caused by our actual terrain object. So what we could possibly do, there's different ways of dealing with it. Like I was saying before, we could actually there's reconstruct the scene, depending on how you want to deal with it, and use alpha maps. For instance, you could have one terrain across here and another terrain in the background, and then go into View and hide the other objects and render them and have their alpha maps, so that we can kind of have that cutoff of the trees right there. That's another way you could do it. Or you could actually import some trees in from View and kind of put them in there, and that'll take care of that effect too. So that way we still get our height, and all I got to do is just add a few of those imported trees in here. We can do it really low resolution, and that won't be a problem. But one major issue is our shadows from our hypervoxels. They're going to appear flat once we kind of work out our surfacing of our terrain to fix these other shadows. Once they kind of show up, you'll notice that they are going across a flat surface, so we have to make some changes for that. And the easiest thing to do is just to create a bump map. So if we go into our surface editor and just under bump, we can create a procedural texture, and we can leave it at turbulence, and we just want to size it in relation kind of to the terrain. So we could do just 0.2 and use texture, and what that will allow us to do is cause some bumpiness on that terrain, because right now all those shadows are going to render smooth. But if we add some bumpiness in there, it will actually make our shadows bumpy as if they were moving over the trees. Now, like I said, there's going to be some problems, especially when we reach these areas in here of the image where there are no trees, but even that will affect still the terrain, and it'll still look better overall, and we don't really need to worry about certain other things happening. And it's just another way to kind of deal with that. Another thing is, what if you wanted to have something in front of the scene? Like, let's say we want to have a tree right here. We, of course, don't have our motion set up right now to show that, considering where our particles are at. But if our particles were going down through here, and we wanted to have maybe a tree right here, and we wanted those particles to go behind that tree, well, what we could actually do, I'm actually going to just demonstrate this with a different object. So I'm going to go ahead and delete these particles and just kind of leave this collision object in here. And we're going to go back into View really quick and just create that tree that we want to have kind of in our foreground right here. So we'll switch back to View, and we want to add a tree. Now, of course, we're using the plum tree in here, so we want them all to match up. So we're going to right mouse click on this tree up here, and we're going to select the plum tree. And this is quite large comparatively to the rest of our trees in the scene, so we're going to want to size that down. And of course we're going to have to make some additional movement to it, so it's by the camera. Oh, make sure we undo that. Select that tree. Just move it in. And as you can see now, we just have some branches up here. And we just want to have so an object can go behind these branches. And the way it's set up in Lightwave right now, we wouldn't be able to do that. I'm going to move this up a little because it's still really not in the right position, because we do want this just pretty much to be a foreground object. But what we need to do now is render just this tree. So I'm going to go ahead to this terrain, and we need to right mouse click, and we want to hide it from the render. And now we have just our tree in the scene. So we're going to go ahead and render this with just the tree. Okay, and now we need to save this color image, and we also need to save our alpha. So if we click on this middle button right here, we're going to get our alpha map, which is going to clip out just our tree. And because all we rendered was the tree, because we hid our terrain from the render, we can use this as a foreground image in Lightwave to hide objects and have them going behind this image. So I'm just going to go ahead and save these, and then we'll go into uh, layout and load it in. We have our color and our alpha loaded into our image editor, into layout, and now we're going to go ahead and put that in the foreground. And how we're going to do that is Control and F7, and under foreground image we want to select that tree color and the tree alpha for our foreground alpha, and we also want to use foreground fader alpha. We'll go ahead and render that and take a look. And as you can see, now we have this tree in the front, and we can see through it to the image behind it. And since this is not actual geometry in the scene, it's just an image, it's going to put this on after, and it's more of a post-process image. So once everything else is rendered, this will apply itself to the scene, overlapping everything else with that alpha map on there. So if I go ahead and just load in a simple object now, perhaps like a ball, we'll be able to see that effect. Okay, we just have this ball, and I'm going to grab go into the surface editor, and we want to change that ball texture to a red, just so we can see it a little better. Turn on smoothing, and I'm going to go ahead and place this around right here, and go ahead and render that, and we can see what happens. Okay, we now have our ball going through, and we can see it through this foreground image. So if we wanted to, we could have this even rolling. This works too if like you're doing particles and maybe you wanted to have rocks rolling through this whole sort of trench, and then we have this nice tree right here where they can pass underneath, and just pretty much as we move this ball around, it will go through and we'll be able to see through this tree right here, and that's just a really neat thing you can do just to add a lot more to your scene. Of course, you could add more trees. You could also edit the color, because as you can see, because these other trees were a lot farther away from them, and because of the lighting, because of that, and the fact that it's an ecosystem, we want to darken this tree a little. You could also go into Photoshop or an image editing program and just adjust it to match up. We could also want to maybe re-render this ecosystem in the back to give it some better anti-aliasing, so we don't get all this real heavy grain in here, and that would probably take care of that. So this is one easy way to integrate Vue with Lightwave, particularly using Vue and bringing it into Lightwave for the render, and doing most of our animation and all that in Lightwave, and like I said, in Vue. And also what we could do is create that animation, and instead of saving our just one frame in the background, we could render it as an animation and project that animation onto the terrain and the background, and that way when our camera is moving across, everything matches up correctly, and that's just a really easy way to add the animation from Vue. But let's say we wanted to really animate in Lightwave and bring it into Vue, so I'm going to show you that next.